The man in the corner of the grand room, the air inside the concert hall felt like polished glass, silent, heavy, waiting to be shattered. Inside that space of velvet seats and golden chandeliers, hundreds had gathered to watch a single man. The audience came dressed in tailored suits, silk scarves, long gowns, and fur-lined coats. Their eyes shone not with humility but pride, the kind of pride that comes with money, with influence, with being part of the so-called elite. They were not here for music alone. They were here to be seen, to boast later about how they saw the master in person. On stage sat Dmitry Alanov, a Russian-born pianist celebrated for his flawless execution and icy charm. His fingers were legendary, known to dance over the keys with the elegance of a winter wind. He had won every award, broken every record, and had developed a reputation that blended brilliance with cruelty. Dmitry didn't just play music. He made statements with his silence, delivered insults through the spaces between notes. And tonight his concert in New York was the highlight of the city's cultural calendar. But in the corner of the hall, where the shadows from the curtains draped, low, sat a man who didn't belong. His hair was messy, a little longer than the fashion of the room permitted. His suit was simple, without a brand tag or sparkle. He didn't take pictures. He didn't sip the champagne. He didn't speak to the crowd. He simply sat, waiting. Unnoticed by most, except for one sharp-eyed usher who whispered to a co-worker, "That's Keanu Reeves." Some laughed quietly at the idea. Why would Keanu Reeves be at a classical concert? Others smirked, thinking he was probably lost or looking for someone famous to talk to. And then, one bold socialite, a woman in a red dress with a pearl chain around her wrist, leaned close to Dmitry during the break. "He's here," she said. "The actor, sitting like a ghost in the corner. Is he a fan of yours?" Dmitry's lips curled. He had seen Keanu. Of course he had. Dmitry saw everyone. "He's not a musician," Dmitry said with a quiet tone that carried the weight of insult. "He plays pretend. I play truth." The woman laughed, too loud. When the concert resumed, Dmitry gave a performance that set the stage on fire without a flame. Every note was perfect, every pause calculated. The room sat frozen under his control. And when he ended his final piece, a delicate version of Rachmaninoff that trembled through the air, the crowd erupted. Applause exploded like thunder through the marble walls, but Keanu didn't clap. He simply watched. That's when Dmitry saw him again. Not as a fan, not as an actor, but as something he didn't understand, someone unshaken, and something about that made Dmitry pause. Later, as guests surrounded the pianist backstage, Dmitry made a choice, a dangerous one. He walked up to the man in the corner, now standing near a hallway exit, about to leave. "You enjoyed the show?" Dmitry asked, his accent wrapped in pride. Keanu smiled, calm. "You play beautifully, technically perfect. That word, technically, burned. It was praise, yes, but not devotion. Have you studied music?" Dmitry asked, tilting his head slightly, eyes narrowing. "A little," Keanu replied. "I love it. I used to play, just for myself." Another guest leaned in. "Maybe next time Dmitry should let you take the stage." The room laughed. Even Dmitry did, but not kindly. "Yes," Dmitry said coldly. "We can have John Wick play Chopin. Very dramatic." Keanu's eyes didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "Maybe one day." That was when the insult reached its peak. Dmitry clapped. A hand on Keanu's shoulder, smiled for the cameras and whispered close enough for only him to hear. "Leave art to the artists." Keanu didn't react. Not the way Dmitry wanted. No anger, no bitterness, only a faint sadness in his eyes. And then he left. But what Dmitry didn't know was that someone had heard the entire exchange. A young woman named Elisa, a stage assistant, barely older than 20, had stood behind a velvet partition checking cables. Her family loved Keanu Reeves. Her father, who had recently passed, used to say that Keanu was a man who lived with both grief and grace. And now, hearing how he was treated, something inside her broke. That night, she followed him. Not out of fear, out of instinct. She found him at the edge of the city, near a quiet old studio with dusty windows and a flickering sign. "Mr. Reeves?" she called softly. Keanu turned, surprised but gentle. "I work at the theater," she said. "I heard what happened. I just wanted to say you didn't deserve that." Keanu smiled kindly. "It's all right. People say things when they're in pain." Elisa hesitated. Then, something came over her. "Do you still play?" Keanu nodded. "Not in public, not for years." "Why not?" He looked at the ground. "It's a long story." "I have time," she said. And so, that night, in a forgotten music studio that once held dreams, Keanu sat down at an old piano. He placed his fingers on the keys, not like a master, not like a star, but like a man remembering something he once loved. Something that once helped him survive the dark. He played not to impress. He played to feel. And as Elisa listened, tears ran down her cheeks. It was not perfect. It was not calculated. It was something deeper. It was real. When he finished, silence filled the room. Not the kind of silence that demands applause. The kind that holds you. Elisa whispered. "You should show them. The world. You have to." Keanu shook his head. "It's not my place." But fate had other plans, because the next day Elisa posted a short clip. Not the whole thing. Just 30 seconds of Keanu's hands on the keys, the melody soft and raw. She didn't write his name. She didn't need to. The internet noticed. Within hours, people began to ask, who is this man playing with such sadness and hope? And Dmitry Alenov. He saw it too. He recognized the fingers, the posture, the truth, and he didn't like what he saw. He didn't like it at all, because it felt like the first time someone had truly spoken back, not with words, with music, and the world was listening. Dmitry watches the viral clip again. His fingers tremble. Something stirs in him that he hasn't felt in years. A fear that maybe perfection isn't enough anymore. The echo they couldn't erase, the morning light painted New York in gold. But for Dmitry Alenov, it brought no warmth. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling, windows of his penthouse, a steaming cup of tea untouched in his hand, eyes glued to the screen in front of him. Again, he played the 30-second clip. Again, he watched those unfamiliar, yet hauntingly graceful fingers float over worn keys. The video had no name, no title, no credits. Only a soft piano melody that sounded like it had been pulled straight from someone's soul. But Dmitry knew those hands. He remembered the moment they shook his after the concert, remembered the weight of that gaze that refused to be humbled by fame. Keanu Reeves, the actor, the one everyone loved because he didn't try to be loved. And now, here he was, daring to touch music in a way Dmitry could never quite explain or control. The clip had spread like wildfire. Thousands of comments flooded beneath it. Strangers were sharing stories of how the tune reminded them of lost parents, broken dreams, or moments when they had nothing left but hope. Some called it the most beautiful thing they'd heard in years. Others simply wrote, "I don't know why this makes me cry, but it does." Dmitry had played on the world's greatest stages. He had received standing ovations from kings, queens, and presidents. But never, never had his music moved the internet like this. He searched desperately for flaws in the performance, anything, to reduce the storm of emotion to something measurable, something logical. But the more he tried, the more it haunted him. Meanwhile, across town, Keanu sat in his modest apartment, quietly sipping coffee as he read messages forwarded to him by Elisa. She had finally told him she'd posted the clip, apologizing in case he was upset. But Keanu wasn't angry. He was surprised, overwhelmed, confused. All he had done was play from a place of truth. He hadn't thought anyone would care, yet here he was, watching strangers beg for more, asking him to release a full performance, questioning who he had once been behind the camera, and under the grief that had long shaped his soul. There were whispers now, rumors that Keanu had studied music in his youth, that he had once been a prodigy who walked away from it all after tragedy struck. And part of that was true. Long before Hollywood, before scripts and directors and sets, there was a young boy in Toronto with calloused fingers and an old upright piano in a cramped apartment. A boy who used to play for his sick sister while their mother cried in the kitchen. A boy who poured his pain into music when words no longer worked. But when she passed, so did his music. He never blamed anyone. He just let the silence take over. And then life took him somewhere else. Somewhere far from keys and melodies. Yet now, the past was knocking. And it wasn't alone. Days passed, and the pressure mounted. Reporters began to gather outside the studio where the clip had been filmed. Musicians posted reaction videos, their eyes watery as they tried to explain why something so simple felt so profound. And then came the invitation, an official public one, from the International Conservatory of Modern Music. They wanted Keanu to perform at their upcoming charity gala. Not act, not speak, just play. One piece, no expectations, only emotion. Elisa handed him the envelope with cautious eyes. "You don't have to say yes," she said. "But maybe it's time they heard all of it." Keanu stared at the paper for a long moment. He had lived many lives, movie star, motorcycle builder, quiet wanderer, but none had terrified him like this. Because this wasn't performance. This was exposure. This was truth. But somewhere, deep inside, something told him to go. Not for them. For her. For the girl who once smiled as he played lullabies beside her hospital bed. For the mother who worked double shifts just to keep his piano lessons going. And maybe, just maybe, for himself, he agreed, quietly, without fanfare. Word spread fast. Some were excited. Others mocked the idea. Headlines debated whether it was a gimmick. Critics questioned if Keanu was qualified to be on such a stage. And behind it all, Dmitry Alanov burned with something he hadn't felt in decades. Uncertainty. He had always controlled the narrative. Always stood alone at the top. But now the world was turning its gaze elsewhere. Not to someone perfect. To someone real. And that, to Dmitry, was a threat unlike any other. He called in favors. Reached out to the gala board. Offered to perform the closing act himself. And they, hungry for ratings and drama, said yes. It would be an unusual pairing, an opening by Keanu Reeves, an ending by Dmitry Alanov. Art meeting legend, tradition meeting surprise, and the world held its breath. As the day approached, Keanu returned to the old studio. Elisa helped him rehearse, not by correcting him, but by listening. Her silence guided him better than any teacher. He chose an original piece, a composition he had written as a boy but never finished. He didn't polish it, didn't add flourishes. He left the mistakes where they belonged. He wanted it to sound like life. The night of the gala arrived. The concert hall was brighter than usual, filled with tension and curiosity. Cameras flashed as celebrities filled the seats. Critics sharpened their pens. And in the front row, Dmitry sat still, his face unreadable. Keanu stepped on stage to silence. No introduction, no spotlight. Just a single stool and the grand piano, under a warm beam of light. He took a slow breath, sat down, and placed his hands on the keys. And for a moment, nothing happened. Then came the music. It was soft at first, like memory. A melody that trembled with hesitation, then slowly opened like a flower in winter. Each note carried weight. Not technical mastery, but raw, honest power. It was the sound of loss, of love, of growing old and realizing how much beauty lives in broken things. People stopped breathing. Even the critics froze, their pens resting idle. As the final note faded, Keanu didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply stood, gave a small nod, and walked off stage. What followed was not applause, not Immediately, it was silence, the kind that follows something sacred. Then finally a wave of clapping rose, not thunderous, but emotional. The kind of applause that people give when they don't know what else to do. Some had tears in their eyes. Others stood slowly, unsure of how to express what they felt. Dmitri remained seated, his hands clasped tightly. Inside, a war raged. He had just witnessed something impossible, something that should not have worked, but did. And now he had to follow it. He had to prove that precision still mattered. As he took the stage for his closing act, his mind burned with doubt. But his pride wouldn't allow him to falter. He played his heart out, flawlessly, thunderously, and yet, as the final crescendo roared and the crowd applauded louder than before, Dmitri felt something hollow in his chest. Like the sound had gone around people, not through them. He bowed, but as he looked out into the crowd, he saw their faces. They had been moved, but not by him. Backstage, Dmitri storms into the hallway and confronts Keanu, his voice sharp, his ego bleeding. "Where did you learn to do that?" he demands. Keanu simply replies, "I didn't. I just stopped hiding." And with that, the walls between them begin to crack. Broken notes, louder truth. The air backstage after the gala performance was different. Not frantic or electric like usual, but heavy, charged, almost trembling with an emotion no one wanted to speak aloud. People moved quietly, stealing glances at one another, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The sound of Keanu's performance lingered in their bones, like the aftertaste of something real and deeply personal. Even the sharpest critics, those trained to dissect technique and form with surgical precision, stood in awkward clusters, unsure whether to applaud what they felt or question why they felt it in the first place. But no one was more disturbed by this strange new atmosphere than Dmitri Alenov. Dmitri's chest felt tight, not from exhaustion but from something far more corrosive: confusion. His own performance had been flawless. He had executed a piece that had taken him months to master. Every note had been exactly where it should be, the tempo perfect, the crescendo powerful, and yet as he stood in front of that crowd he had felt them slipping away. Not disrespectfully, not intentionally. They were still there physically, still watching him, still clapping, still rising to their feet at the end. But the depth, the emotional surrender that he used to own, was missing. It was as if he had walked onto a stage expecting to cast a spell, only to find the audience already under someone else's. He walked down the hallway with long, quick strides, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. Assistants and staff members stepped aside silently as he passed, their eyes avoiding his. He reached the dressing room area and saw the door half open. Keanu was inside, sitting on a small couch, bent forward with a towel in his hands, not wiping sweat but simply holding it as if grounding himself in the moment. Elisa stood near the corner, clutching a clipboard, her face pale but glowing. "You stole my audience," Dmitri said sharply, stepping inside without knocking. Keanu looked up calmly, his eyes steady and without a trace of defensiveness. "I didn't come to steal anything," he said. "I just played." "Don't give me that," Dmitri snapped, his voice brittle. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You've been planning this since that night in the concert hall. Pretending to be humble, playing the mystery man, feeding the world your little moment of broken genius." Keanu stood slowly, not aggressively, just enough to meet him eye to eye. "I'm not pretending, Dmitri. I've lost too much in life to pretend about anything anymore." The words landed harder than Dmitri expected. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. It was as if a mirror had been placed in front of him, one that showed not just his reflection but every empty ovation, every performance he had given out of pride rather than passion. "What gives you the right?" he finally asked, softer this time. "You left this world. You walked away from music. You didn't earn this stage. You didn't suffer for it like we did." Keanu nodded, understanding the pain behind those words. "You're right. I did walk away. But not because I didn't care, because I cared too much. I lost my sister when I was 16. I used to play for her every night in that hospital. When she died, the piano became a grave I couldn't visit. I didn't stop playing because I forgot how. I stopped because the music reminded me of her face, of the sound of her breathing, of the way she would smile even through pain. Dmitri blinked, taken aback. The arrogance in his posture faltered just slightly. Keanu continued, his voice low. You think suffering gives you the right to own music. But music doesn't belong to the perfect. It belongs to the broken. It belongs to the people who can't explain their pain in words. It belongs to silence, to memory, to the moments we wish we could keep forever. Elisa stepped forward, her voice trembling. That's why it moved them. Not because he played every note right, but because every note meant something. Dmitri turned to her, his eyes narrowing. You posted that video. She nodded. Yes. He looked at both of them, then turned and left without another word. But his footsteps this time were slower, not out of defeat, out of thought. The media storm after the gala was instant and relentless. Headlines exploded across every platform. Keanu Reeves plays original piece, leaves audience in tears. From actor to artist, Keanu's piano debut redefines musical storytelling. Dmitri Alenov's perfection meets Keanu's raw honesty. Who truly won the night? Some praised both artists, trying to balance the narrative. But most gravitated toward the emotion, the surprise, the vulnerability. Social media lit up with stories from fans, many of whom admitted they didn't even like classical music before that night, but had felt something awaken inside them when they heard Keanu's performance. Keanu tried to stay out of the spotlight. He turned down interviews. He refused offers for commercial albums. But the pressure kept building. Producers, philanthropists, and artists reached out, offering collaborations, film scores, charity concerts. He didn't answer most of them. He was still processing, still unsure if this path was something he wanted to walk again. But something else had quietly begun to change in the shadows. Dmitri Alenov retreated from the public eye for weeks. No interviews, no public statements. Not even his closest staff knew where he had gone. He disappeared to his countryside estate in France, a place he hadn't visited in over a decade. There, away from the clamor of critics and fans, he did something unexpected. He stopped playing. At first, it was out of frustration, then confusion, then a need to understand. He stared at his own grand piano for hours some days, hands in his lap, unwilling to touch the keys, because deep inside, Dmitri Alenov was facing a truth that terrified him more than any rival. He had forgotten how to feel. He remembered a time long ago when he played as a boy just for himself, not for judges, not for fame, just to feel less alone. But over the years, that boy had been buried under trophies, deadlines, and perfection. Keanu's performance hadn't just challenged him, it had exposed him. And for the first time in his life, Dmitri began to wonder if he had been playing the wrong way all along. Then, one evening, as rain tapped softly against the window pane, he sat down at the piano. No cameras, no audience, no pressure. Just him, and the keys. And he played. Not something written by a master. Not something memorized or rehearsed. He played what he felt. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't structured, but it was real. And when he stopped, Dmitri Alenov felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Release. He didn't speak to anyone about that night. Not yet. But he called his agent and made a request that shocked everyone. He wanted to perform again, but not alone. He wanted to share the stage with Keanu Reeves, a duet, not a battle, not a showcase, a conversation. The idea swept through the industry like a storm. People didn't know how to react. Two men from different worlds, one the image of perfection, the other the soul of vulnerability. What would it look like? What would it sound like? The announcement trended worldwide. Some called it genius. Others said it would never work. But the tickets sold out in hours. And behind closed doors, in a quiet studio in New York, the two men met again. No crowd, no judgment, just a piano. Are you sure about this? Keanu asked, looking at Dmitri. Dmitri nodded. I don't know if I've ever been more sure about anything. They sat down together side by side, and they began to play. Not to compete, to understand. Their fingers touched the same note. A harmony forms, but just as they find balance, a message arrives. An urgent call from Elisa, her voice trembling. Something's happened, and it might change everything. The storm before the crescendo, the sky over New York turned a deep bruised gray, the evening their first rehearsal ended. Not because of weather, but because something unseen had shifted in the air, like the tension before a thunderstorm. Inside the old rehearsal studio where Keanu and Dmitri had just completed a quiet, soul-stirring run-through of their unfinished duet, everything felt still. Too still. They had played for hours, barely speaking, letting the music do the talking. It wasn't perfect, but that wasn't the point. For once, Dmitri didn't count the seconds between notes. He didn't tighten his jaw when a chord came late, and Keanu didn't look over nervously every time his fingers trembled. They played like men who were slowly learning to trust again, not just each other, but themselves. But the harmony was short-lived. Keanu's phone buzzed. Once, twice, then again. He picked it up slowly, glancing at the screen. It was Elisa. He answered. Elisa. Her voice came fast, breathless, shaking. Keanu, something's wrong. I don't know how to say this, but the internet. It's everywhere now. Someone leaked your hospital videos. The old ones. The private ones. The footage of you and your sister. Of you playing piano for her. Someone dug them out and posted them with your name and your story, and now people think they know everything. Keanu didn't respond immediately. His hand tightened around the phone. Dmitri looked at him, his brow furrowed, unsure what had happened, but sensing the weight in the silence. Who posted it? Keanu finally asked. Elisa hesitated. We're still trying to trace it, but the video, it's spreading fast. People are calling you the grief pianist. Some are crying over it, yes, but others are tearing you apart, saying it's a stunt, a sympathy grab, that you planned this whole story for attention. The room seemed to darken. Keanu stared at the far wall as if trying to find a crack to breathe through. For years, his grief had been something sacred, quiet, personal. He never used it for attention. He never wanted the world to know about the nights he played lullabies to a girl who could barely keep her eyes open, or the moments he cried over a broken piano when the silence in the apartment became too much to bear. He had carried that pain with the dignity of a man who never wanted it turned into currency. And now it was out there. Dissected, manipulated, made into headlines. I need to go, Keanu said softly. I have to see Elisa. Dmitri didn't stop him. But as the door closed, he felt something stir inside him. It wasn't just concern. It was guilt, a very specific kind of guilt, because Dmitri had once confided in his personal assistant, during a bitter, private moment, that if Keanu couldn't be stopped with skill, maybe he could be exposed through emotion. He never told her to leak anything. He didn't ask her to act, but he had planted a seed, and now it was growing into something poisonous. Keanu reached Elisa's apartment just after sundown. She opened the door with swollen eyes, clearly rattled. Her laptop sat on the kitchen table, open to dozens of tabs filled with headlines, reaction videos, and social media chaos. One clip looped in the background. Footage from 20 years ago, a grainy hospital room, a teenage Keanu gently playing piano while a fragile girl smiled weakly from her bed. How did they get this? He asked. Elisa shook her head. I only found out because my inbox exploded. People are tagging me everywhere because of the first clip I posted. They think I'm part of some plan. Keanu sat down slowly, rubbing his eyes. The room was quiet except for the noise of the internet screaming through the laptop speakers. He clicked one of the headlines. Keanu Reeves's performance was no accident. It was orchestrated grief. Another read, From actor to manipulator? The truth behind Keanu's piano debut. But the worst was a comment beneath the video. He's just acting again. He can't stop pretending, even when it's about pain. Keanu closed the laptop gently. You should take a break, Elisa said. You don't have to do the concert. People are being cruel because they don't understand. Keanu looked at her. No, I have to do it. That's exactly why I have to do it. She looked confused. Because they think emotion is a trick. They think feeling something is a weakness. If I walk away now, they win. And worse, they make people afraid to share their pain. Keanu stood up, his voice steady again. We'll play that duet, Elisa. And we won't do it for headlines. We'll do it for every kid who ever played music for someone they loved. For every person who thought their pain made them unworthy. We'll do it for the broken ones. And with that, he left to prepare. Across the city, Dmitri sat at his piano again, trying to find clarity. But it didn't come in melodies. It came in memories. He remembered being a young man, not yet famous, playing for his dying mentor in a quiet nursing home in Prague. No cameras, no stage, just one man giving another a final gift. That memory had always been sacred to Dmitri. It was what drove him to pursue music as a language deeper than speech. But somewhere along the line, he had lost that purpose. He had replaced meaning with medals. And now, seeing Keanu reminded him of everything he had forgotten. He picked up the phone and dialed. This is Dmitri Alenov. I need to speak with KeanuReeves. It's urgent. A day later, they met again. Not in a studio, not in a concert hall, but in the cemetery where Keanu's sister had been buried. Keanu stood quietly near the grave, holding a single white flower. Dmitri approached with hesitation, a rare look of humility on his face. I didn't know, Dmitri said. Keanu didn't respond. I didn't know she existed. I didn't know your story. And if anything I said or did led to what happened with that video, then I am sorry. Keanu looked at him finally. His voice was soft. The thing about pain, Dmitri, is that you never know where it begins or where it ends. Sometimes it's passed like a note in a song. You don't even know you're carrying it until someone else hears it. Dmitri nodded slowly. Then let's carry it together. On stage. No masks. No roles. Just the music. They shook hands. When the night of the duet arrived, the city stood still. The venue was different this time. An outdoor amphitheater overlooking the river. Thousands gathered in quiet anticipation. There were no commercials, no flashy intros, no promotional gimmicks. Just two men and a single grand piano in the center of the stage. The world watched not to be entertained, but to be moved. And when the music began, something incredible happened. They didn't play in turns. They played together. Dmitri's hands danced through structured melodies, filled with technique and form. Keanu's hands wove around them, adding warmth, vulnerability, unpredictability. Where one built tension, the other softened it. Where one paused, the other answered. It was not a performance. It was a conversation between souls, a healing one. The audience sat frozen, breath held, and when the final note faded, there was no applause at first, just silence, deep, sacred. Then it came, not in waves, but in unity, a standing ovation that rose like a heartbeat. Keanu and Dmitri stood together not as rivals but as something more rare, as men who had survived themselves and chosen music to say what words never could. Back in the dressing room, Elisa checks her messages and turns pale. She runs to Keanu, eyes wide. Someone just sent this, she whispers, handing him a phone. On the screen is a photo from decades ago, Keanu as a child sitting at a piano, with a shadowy figure standing behind him. The caption says, "You don't remember me, but I never forgot you." The past, it seems, isn't finished with him yet. The forgotten chord. The concert was over, but the world was still listening. The internet had turned into a sea of emotional reactions, from tears to tributes, with people across continents describing how the duet between KeanuReeves and Dmitri Alenov had changed something inside them. It wasn't just about music anymore. It was about truth, about what happens when two men from opposite ends of art and life allow themselves to be seen, not as icons or technicians, but as vulnerable human beings. While critics tried to categorize it, fans wrote poems, made paintings, started online forums. People were sending stories of how they returned to their own abandoned instruments, dusted off guitars, violins, keyboards, saying they were inspired, not by perfection, but by rawness. One post read, "Keanu played like he remembered a world that had forgotten him, and somehow, in that sound, I remembered myself." But that moment of light was about to be pierced by something far older and far more personal. Elisa stood backstage in the quiet of the dressing room, scrolling through messages of congratulations and praise. Her eyes scanned the screen, her expression soft, until a sudden image stopped her. Her heart thudded against her chest. It was a photo, blurry, clearly old. A child, maybe 9 or 10 years old, sat at a piano, hunched slightly forward, fingers poised above the keys. He had black hair, dark eyes, unmistakable. It was Keanu. But what chilled her wasn't the boy. It was the shadow behind him. A tall man, blurred by movement, standing slightly out of frame, only half his face visible, but enough to unsettle her. The man's hand hovered just above the boy's shoulder, like he was guiding him or controlling him. Beneath the image was a single caption, "You don't remember me, but I never forgot you." She rushed out of the dressing room, heart pounding. Keanu was in the hallway, speaking softly to a reporter who had stayed behind to thank him for the performance. Elisa reached him, grabbed his arm, and held out the phone. He stared at the image. His breath caught. His face didn't change, not completely, but his eyes clouded, like something inside him had shifted. A wall cracking, a door opening. "Where did this come from?" he asked quietly. "Someone texted it to the studio's anonymous line," she replied. "They didn't sign their name. That number doesn't trace back to anything. It's been deleted." Keanu didn't respond for a long time. His hands trembled slightly, the first time she had seen that since the early rehearsals. Finally, he turned away from the hallway and walked into the empty stage again, sitting on the piano bench without touching the keys. Elisa followed, unsure whether to speak. After several minutes, Keanu whispered, "I know who he is." She sat down near the stage floor, her voice small. "Who?" He didn't look at her when he answered. "His name was Oliver. He was my first piano teacher. My mother hired him when I was 7 after she heard me plucking melodies on a toy keyboard. He was talented, patient at first, then different." Elisa didn't interrupt. The air between them was heavy with memories neither of them had lived together, yet both could feel. "He said I had a gift," Keanu continued, "but he didn't want me to just play. He wanted to shape me, mold me. Sometimes he'd hold my hands down if I made a mistake. Once, he snapped a ruler against my wrist, said I was wasting potential. I told my mom I didn't want lessons anymore. She thought it was just nerves. She didn't know. Eventually he left, moved away. We never spoke again." "And you forgot him?" Elisa asked gently. "Not forgot," Keanu said. "I buried him, like everything else from that time." They sat in silence again, the piano between them like a monument to something too fragile to break open, but too loud to ignore. Over the next few days, more messages followed. Old photographs, newspaper clippings. One article mentioned a man named Oliver Traxton, once a rising composer who mysteriously vanished from the scene after allegations surfaced about unethical teaching practices. Nothing was ever proven. No charges were filed. But whispers had chased him out of the professional circuit. And now, somehow, he had returned, watching from the shadows. Maybe not for revenge, maybe for recognition, or closure. No one knew. Keanu decided to confront the past. He called in a contact from his early acting days, a former investigator turned security consultant. Together, they began tracing the digital trail. Eventually, a lead surfaced. A hotel reservation, under a false name but with a familiar pattern. Each city Keanu had recently visited had also been visited by the same alias. Someone had been following him, not in public, not in an obvious way, but always nearby. Always watching, Dmitri, when informed, insisted on being involved. "If this man is trying to haunt you," he said, "then maybe the best answer is not silence. Maybe it's music." The idea that followed seemed impossible. They would hold. One final performance, a small private one, no press, no announcements, just a room, a piano, and an invitation sent directly to Oliver Traxton, not as bait, as a reckoning. Keanu agreed. It was held in an abandoned concert hall on the outskirts of the city. Once glorious, now partially restored, it had become a secret haven for underground performances. Only a handful of people knew the address. The stage lights were dim. The audience consisted of a dozen trusted friends, including Elisa, Dmitri's manager, and a few musicians who had helped coordinate the event. One chair in the back remained empty, reserved for the man no one had seen in decades. 30 minutes passed, then 40. The door creaked open. A tall man with graying hair, dressed in a plain coat, stepped in slowly. His eyes scanned the room, with no fear, only calculation. He walked to the back and sat down silently, as if he belonged there all along. Keanu stepped on stage. He didn't introduce himself. He simply played. This piece wasn't soft. It wasn't graceful. It was jagged, powerful, full of shadows and unexpected notes. It was everything he remembered and everything he never said. The anger, the confusion, the guilt, the forgiveness. All of it inside one composition he had never named. When he finished, there was no applause, only the sound of breathing. Deep, uneven, alive. Oliver stood slowly, nodded once, and left the hall. No words, no confrontation, just a final note played between them. Afterward, Dmitri approached Keanu with a small box. "You dropped this backstage." "Before the first gala," he said. Inside was a photo. His sister, smiling, holding a folded piece of sheet music. Keanu had thought it lost. He held it now like a relic. "You're not just an actor," Dmitri said. "You're a composer of memory. And memory, I've learned, is the only music that never fades." That night, the world didn't know what happened. They didn't see the final performance, they didn't witness the man in the back row, but they would soon hear something else. Because for the first time, Keanu agreed to record a single album. One story, not of fame, but of return. Weeks later, the album is released anonymously. No artist name, no title. But hidden deep inside the last track, a reversed whisper is discovered by a listener. When played forward, it says, "Forgive me, Oliver." And across the world, in a small town, an old man smiles, tears falling silently. The music had spoken. And he had heard. The final performance of Silence, when the unnamed album dropped quietly in the midnight hours of a Tuesday morning, it wasn't accompanied by marketing campaigns or celebrity endorsements. There were no press tours, no late-night show appearances, no interviews. It arrived in the world like a breath after a long cry, soft, unnoticed by many, but unforgettable to those who felt it. The streaming platforms labeled it simply, "Unknown Artist." There were no song titles, only track numbers. The artwork was a black screen, a single white dot in the center. Yet by sunrise, something strange had happened. People began talking about it. Not shouting, not promoting, just talking. The way they talked about lost friends, about things they couldn't explain. The album wasn't just heard, it was felt. Each track felt like a whisper of someone's memory, like it had been written for a moment they couldn't forget but had no words for. And deep inside the final track, track 12, some listeners noticed something unusual. If reversed, at the very edge of the fading sound, a voice could be heard. Soft, almost broken. "Forgive me, Oliver." That single phrase turned whispers into a wildfire. Forums exploded with theories. Musicians began analyzing the chord structures, tracing them to older compositions rumored to have once belonged to Oliver Traxton. They found fragments, notes from forgotten pieces, reworked, reimagined, made whole through the pain of memory. It became clear this wasn't just a tribute, It was a farewell, a final letter sealed in sound, and though Keanu never confirmed he had created the album, the world knew. Not because of evidence, because of emotion. Weeks passed. The album climbed the charts without a name. Critics who had once doubted now wrote in awe. One said, "This album is what happens when grief becomes generosity." Another wrote, "It reminds us that silence too has music, if you're willing to listen." And for the first time in decades, the conversation in the world of music wasn't about sales or skill or spectacle. It was about truth. Dmitri, meanwhile, returned to Russia briefly to visit the grave of his mentor, the one who had once told him that music was not in the fingers, but in the fear. Standing alone in the snow, he placed a single flower beside the stone and whispered, "You were right. I just didn't know how to be afraid until now." He left behind a copy of the unnamed album with a handwritten note. "This is the music I was never brave enough to play." Keanu remained out of the public eye, retreating into simplicity once again. He turned down offers to tour, to headline, to profit. He wasn't interested in being a musician for fame. He had already lived that kind of life in another form. This was different. Sacred. Personal. He spent his days walking through the city anonymously, sometimes stopping at parks, libraries, or bookstores, places where people forgot about fame and just existed. Sometimes he would visit music schools, not to speak, but to listen. One afternoon, he sat outside a community center listening to a child play a shaky version of Beethoven through the open window, his eyes closed. His fingers moved slightly in the air. He didn't need a stage to play. The music was with him now, always. But something still lingered. A final concert had been whispered about for weeks. Something intimate. Something private. No tickets. No recordings. Just a gathering of hearts that needed healing. The location was a mystery. The invitations were handwritten and hand-delivered. Only those who had been touched deeply by the music were selected. And when the night finally came, it wasn't held in a concert hall or a theater or even a gallery. It was held in a place most had forgotten existed, an old cathedral on the edge of the city. The building had once hosted choirs and weddings and funerals. Now it stood mostly in silence. Its stained glass windows faded but still magnificent in moonlight. Inside, pews were filled not with elites or celebrities, but with regular people. Teachers, janitors, veterans, widows, orphans, the ones who had written letters saying the album helped them grieve, helped them heal. Some had lost loved ones, some had lost themselves. All had found something in the music that brought them back. Dmitri sat in the front row, dressed in a modest gray coat. No entourage, no fanfare. Beside him sat Elisa, who clutched a small notebook, filled with stories fans had sent her, stories of rebirth, of hope. She didn't plan to read them, just hold them. As a reminder. Then the lights dimmed, and Keanu walked in, not from behind the curtain, not from the front, but from the side, entering through a small wooden door meant for clergy. He wore no tuxedo, no stage costume, just a black sweater and slacks. His face looked older now, not aged, but etched with honesty. He walked slowly, to the piano in the center of the cathedral floor. It wasn't grand. It was old, slightly out of tune. And that's why he chose it, because it sounded like life. He didn't speak. He sat, and he played. What followed was not a concert. It was a confession. Keanu's fingers told stories without words, stories of childhood nights filled with whispers and worry, of a girl who once smiled in a hospital bed, of a mother who worked too many shifts just to pay for her son's music dreams, of a man who lost himself in Hollywood and found himself again in the echo of an old piano. Each note was an apology, a thank you, a memory, a goodbye. Tears flowed silently in the room. Even Dmitri, the once unbreakable master of perfection, wiped his eyes without shame. And when Keanu reached the final chords, he did something no one expected. He stood. He walked to the back of the cathedral, where a small wooden case stood quietly by a stone wall. He opened it. Inside was an old, slightly damaged upright piano, the one he used to play in his childhood home, the one his mother had saved from a pawn shop, paying in small monthly installments over 2 years. It had been restored by Elisa, in secret, using contacts from a network of piano restorers who had followed the story since the first clip. Keanu sat again. He placed his fingers on those familiar, slightly chipped keys, and he played the lullaby, the same lullaby he once played for his sister, the same one from the hospital. This time, though, it didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like peace. When it ended, he stood once more, nodded to the audience, and walked out the same way he came, in no encore, no applause, just silence, the kind of silence that says everything. Outside, snow had started to fall softly. The guests left slowly, quietly, holding the moment in their hearts like a fragile candle against the wind. Dmitri remained behind, staring at the piano. He walked over, placed his hand gently on the keys and whispered, "Thank you." Elisa found Keanu near the garden behind the cathedral. He looked up at the sky, letting snowflakes fall into his hair. "Do you think she heard it?" he asked softly. Elisa smiled, her eyes wet. "I think she never stopped listening." And in that quiet night, with nothing but snow and music in the air, a man who had once walked away from the piano finally walked toward it. For good.